Can I tell you something about what it takes to prove a male doctor wrong?
Yes, please. This is wisdom that I'm in desperate need of, and I
Yes,
can sense I can sense a juicy story coming.
absolutely. So, this is a story about one woman's journey to prove male doctors wrong during the Crimean War. So, this is back in the 19th century in Crimea, which is in the eastern part of Asia. It is in modern day Ukraine. And the British were involved in a conflict known.
The British were involved
Yes,
in a war?
in a war. Who would have thunk
No,
it?
I don't believe that one.
So the British were involved in a war between the Ottoman Turks and the Russians, and they were siding with the Ottoman Turks. So they had military bases in Constantinople, which is really close to Crimea. When the war started, the first modern war correspondent reported on the conditions of the war and of the army hospitals. This made it back to the London Times, which made the British public aware of just how many people were dying during this war. One of the people that was aware of this London Times news was one Florence Nightingale.
Enter our protagonist.
Yes, so Florence Nightingale was highborn, well educated, and knew a lot about nursing. During these years, nursing wasn't what we think of nursing as today. We need to remember we're in 19th century healthcare land. So
The church is still citing women as not witch. You can't burn them anymore, but you can still suspect that they're witches in medicine, right?
Yeah, the women that were able to practice any kind of medicine actually had to learn through the church too. So Florence Nightingale learned through a German church. That's a little side note.
I just want to go back to this. Like, more or less, women were not surgeons
Yes.
or doctors.
Yes.
They were still nurses, and nothing against nursing. We'll get into how important it is. I think it is important to preface that because it's such an important theme in this story.
Absolutely. So Florence Nightingale took it upon herself to reach out to the powers that be in the British government and got an officially sanctioned trip with her and 38 other women who were going to provide healthcare to the British soldiers that were dying like crazy. And when she first got there, she describes it as the kingdom of hell. Like truly horrific stuff going on.
Great.
And one of the reasons why it was so horrific is all of their hospitals were overcrowded. They were stuffing people into rooms. It was incredibly unsanitary, which meant that a lot of people were dying of disease, preventable disease.
That we would see it as now.
Yeah.
But back in the 19th century, well, we're about to hear that germs weren't, I don't want to say invented yet. They were around the whole time. Germs weren't discovered yet.
Yes. So for those of you that know the term germ theory doesn't come out until 1861. The Crimean War is from 1853 to 1856. So we are just before germ theory is first published. So Florence Nightingale sees the conditions and thinks to herself, this is not a place where people are going to recover from these wounds, and we need to do something about it. So at first she was very cautious, understanding that this was not only a patriarchal healthcare system, but it was in the military too, which adds another level to it. And so she watched. Florence Nightingale had a hypothesis. She thought that more soldiers were dying of disease and germs than battle wounds. And so this is a similar thing that's taught with the American Civil War. Same thing's happening in Britain a decade earlier. And Florence Nightingale realizes that the one way that she could figure this out, prove it is true or not true, and have irrefutable evidence that would ultimately change a lot of medical history was to collect data.
I mean, it makes sense if, you're a doctor or a nurse. It's kind of what you got to do. But I do think it's relevant to add that, yes, she had to collect data to prove a point, but she also had to be 100% true when bringing this to her male counterparts.
Absolutely. It's this collection of statistics to prove a truth or to quantify a truth. It's the root of all data science and proving things with data. So she would go around the hospital late at night with a lantern, which gave her the nickname Lady with the Lamp. And she would observe patients. She would record data about patient outcomes. And as she gained more influence in that hospital, she started taking control over a lot of the ins and outs of the hospital, how efficiently it was run, how clean and sanitary spaces were. And the ultimate outcome of that is that patients died of disease at a much, much lower rate in the second half of the Crimean War.
After she made it there.
After
more or
she
less.
made it there.
Hmm.
And so the Crimean War ends in 1856. And Florence Nightingale is considered a British war hero because of the amount of people that she saved from preventable disease. Queen Victoria catches wind of what happened and invites Florence Nightingale to talk to her. She presented a lot of the information and a lot of the statistics that she gathered while serving in the Crimean War. And one of the visualizations, because she made data visualizations, which all had to be drawn out by hand. There's no Excel, there's no pie chart type stuff. She made a data visualization showing the difference in death from preventable disease from the first half of the war compared to the second half. And this data visualization, we'll show it on the screen. It's kind of hard to read, but it's a really famous one. The version that we know today that's all colored and looks the way it does is a published version that comes out 2 years after meeting with the Queen, but it's taught in a lot of data visualization courses as a quintessential example of what using data to improve public health, to improve gender equity too, subsequently, what it looks like. Because Florence Nightingale, after the war, not only is a war hero, but has funds raised on her behalf so that she can start the very first scientific-based nursing school. Like our modern nursing system is all based off of Florence Nightingale and her first British nursing school, which opened in 1860. So that's the story of Florence Nightingale. And that's why she's often remembered as the founder of modern nursing. When I was researching, she's such a big cultural figure that a lot of historians say it's difficult to parse through what parts are myth and what parts are actually Florence Nightingale at this point. But regardless, very significant historical event. And I think it has a lot of points that we should talk about. So we have two general questions. One is, what does it take for a new idea to be accepted by the healthcare system? And then the other one is more of a comment, but to discuss how women have to go above and beyond to prove their point in male-dominated spaces, or to communicate truth in male-dominated spaces. Let's start off talking about Florence. What do you want to?
Yeah, let's talk about Florence for
Okay.
a little bit, because those questions are great, but I mean, she just seemed like such a juicy gal.
Yeah.
I feel like we got to give her a little time in this debrief. I think that her story is really fascinating, and surprisingly, it's one that I actually hadn't heard before I met you, but I think it seems like she's pretty relevant, not necessarily in pop culture, but in science. So I'm sure a lot of you out there have heard of her, but if not, I'm glad that her story has been shared. I think something that stood out to me in her story was the fact that she was highborn.
Yeah.
Or she came from a family with money, and so she already had not the credentials, but she had almost the quote unquote proof that she could do anything she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And that sucks, but it's also a really important part of the story. And who knows when germs or just like good health practices would have started without her.
Yeah.
And so when I heard this story, I was like, oh, why couldn't she have just been a peasant, man? Like that would have made it a lot juicier. But I don't know. I just wanted to comment on that because that's where my brain was going, and I don't want people to dwell on the fact that she already had like a good life.
Yeah.
Because she still chose to contribute so much to the world.
I want to add to that as well, because my perspective on her upbringing and like how that contributes to her legacy is, this is someone that we can say with our modern terminology, she was born with privilege, right? But what
Yeah.
she did with that privilege is she pushed boundaries for women. Because she was already highborn, she had access to education, which we know is vital for being able to question power and to challenge power. So she was well educated. She had a family that had money enough to be able to support her. But most importantly, for this Crimean War story, she was friends with the British Secretary of State at War's wife and husband. And so
see, there we go, right?
her first letter was to the wife, and the husband was mailing her at the same time. So it was passing in the mail sort of stuff. But yeah, she had connections to the people that got stuff done in Britain, which without the help of that establishment, it would
She
have been,
probably wouldn't have even made it to the war, right?
Exactly. So that does have to be considered, that just because someone is born with that privilege, it's about what they do with it. And I think Florence Nightingale is a great example of giving a lot of that power back to women by, I mean, giving it. So I also looked up like what was it like for women in the Victorian era in terms of working, and a lot of them were in the workforce but didn't have a lot of the private property privileges, voting privileges. All those privileges were not there, so they were forced to work but didn't get really any of the privileges of it. And so this created a new profession for women at the time.
I just want to step back on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like when specifically men say that a certain figure gave power back to women or gave power to women, because I feel like there's just kind of an icky undertone to the word power.
Yeah.
And I get what you're saying, and it really has nothing to do with your sentiment, but it irks me.
Yeah.
A little. And yes, like Victorian England was not a good place for women. That is a well-known fact.
Yeah.
And I'm very thankful that Flogo, or whatever her name was, Florence Nightingale, was able to, I would say, more like reinvigorate what nursing is.
Mm-hmm.
Because throughout history, women have traditionally been quote unquote healers.
Yeah.
Now they're doctors. That word, or that term for helping people medically, has been recycled throughout time.
Yeah.
And I think this, or what she did, helps establish what we view as modern medicine. But I don't necessarily think she gave power back to women. I think women have always had that power. And you can call it whatever you want, if it's like the being able to nurture or just genuinely caring for other people when maybe men traditionally haven't. So I just wanted to make that clear, especially if there's like any men out there listening that use that term a lot, like specifically in power.
Yeah.
When talking about women, I think it's kind of a dangerous term.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you brought that up, because we've talked about that before. And
yeah, and I think this is like, Florence did a lot of great things, but I think she more so reinvented an already existing, you're right, it's not a profession, but like an already existing practice.
Yeah.
And she more or less popularized it for women, mostly white women.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course.
Got to bring that into it, to be able to practice in medicine alongside men.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is nursing, which we know if we're just going to talk about the medical field in general and we're talking about the questions, nursing is predominantly comprised of women.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed at all. Yes, there are more female doctors, but it's still such a low percentage. And I was thinking about this earlier. You know, how is this relevant to today? How does Florence Nightingale's story impact medicine today? And it made me think a lot of the push for women in STEM.
Yes.
And that is its own thing. But even just the fact that institutions or universities have to more or less say, like, yep, we're allowing women, we want them here. Just that they have to say that is problematic. I'm not saying I'm against women in STEM.
Yeah.
I'm very pro women in STEM, but I also want to make it clear that women have always been in STEM and they've always been the leaders in STEM. And that's not talked about very much. So I think that is the real power, to use your word, behind this story, is it shows that, yes, leaders in medicine, the mother of medicine or nursing, was a woman, not a man, was a woman. And she had to make this ridiculous looking diagram. Please look it up if you can't see it on the screen. It's called the Diagram of Causes of Mortality. Very difficult to read.
Yes.
But that she had to dedicate years into making this just to get male doctors or her counterparts around her to take her seriously.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. And I'm not saying that in science you shouldn't have to prove it. You should. But it makes me very, very upset when female or just non-male doctors or anyone in STEM have to prove it so much more than men do. It's really, really upsetting.
Yeah.
And this was a while ago and nothing has changed,
Yeah.
When we talk about stories in the past, you kind of hope that things are different. But I think with this story, they're not. It's moving at a very slow pace. And I'm not interested in STEM. I don't have a lot of friends who are. So I can't emotionally relate to this. But I unfortunately have had to spend a lot of time in hospitals and have a lot of doctors with some of my health conditions. And I have never been treated poorly by a female doctor. I have been treated horribly by several male doctors. So that's how I can connect to this story now. And it's so bad to the point where I won't have a male doctor. I just won't. And I know a lot of women who won't. So I'm curious, as a man, what you think of that.
I think when confronting something like patriarchy, you have the first phase of patriarchy bad. I'm not going to benefit from this at all, because you're in denial of it being a system that you're blind to, that you just can't see the symptoms of, and you're constantly benefiting from. The end of, not the end, the part where you're on the journey of confronting patriarchy is when you start to see how you yourself continue to reinforce it. And you need to be conscious of that continuing to reinforce patriarchy so that you can stop it. Like, stop reinforcing patriarchy. And so for me, and hearing your story, looking at this data visualization, and remembering specifically the book Data Feminism, which was the first book I read about data science at all. And it's a great read for anyone that's interested in data science and social sciences, regardless. I remember being of the mentality that unless it's in data, unless it's in numbers, it can't be real or it can't be provable. And that comes from a very, I think, it comes from a very 50s modernist philosophy towards knowledge. And it comes from being in a very STEM heavy space for a while. But by the end of reading Data Feminism, something switched within me where it was, yes, there's all this talk about using data to prove a point. And this being the ridiculous barrier that women have to substantiate certain points that if a man said it, likely would be like, oh, like we'll get, funding for research and we'll do this and we'll do that and like get into all the textbooks as fast as possible. I started to learn that listening to stories and not you can't think about people's personal experiences as whether or not they can be proven, because personal experience is personal experience. And I think that once that switched within me towards the end of reading that book, and especially hearing your experiences with healthcare, it just continues to always surprise me. Actually, not surprise me. It continues to, I continue to be reminded of it being a system. And I like in being disappointed when it keeps on showing up. So yeah, I think that I've learned a lot through experience, through, getting the data thrown at me. But I think that part of the reason why I feel so strongly about like this data visualization, and I remember it after taking courses like well over a year ago, is because it's what showed me what flipped my mentality was that with data, not even the greatest skeptic can say you're wrong. And it's like when it comes to doing things for the social good, there's something really powerful about using data to do it. It's just, in general, if you have the data and you can really back it up and you can use the scientific method and all that, you can defend it to the end of the earth. And for some things, some social issues, like that is an incredibly powerful tool. Data can always be questioned, though. I will add that.
Well, and that I love that. And I definitely agree with everything you said. I think in our modern world, meaning post 2020, data that was presented about a certain worldwide virus
yes,
was pushed back on a lot.
Yeah.
And that was really frustrating to see. So, although I agree that you can't argue with data, unfortunately, politically and just culturally now, that's happening more.
Yeah.
And more. And I can't imagine what it's like to actually be a woman in healthcare trying to already battle your boss or the people you work with. And then on top of that, having to deal with just gaining trust from your patients.
Yeah.
I wonder if Florence experienced that actually. Because I'm thinking about, when I hear these stories, I like to think about what their day-to-day experiences were like. And of course, I never lived in the 19th century. Maybe I did and I just don't remember. But I wonder how much pushback she got, not only from the doctors around her, but from her patients.
Yeah.
Because being a patient in war, and who God knows what happens to you, not only is that very vulnerable, but it's such a scary and isolating experience. And if you're not comfortable or familiar with women in healthcare, or maybe you think they're an evil spirit, like I'm just kind of grasping at straws here, but I am wondering what her day-to-day experience was. And of course we won't actually really know, but wondering about all the comments and pushback she went through and still publish this.
Yeah.
Because I think that's an even more compelling part of her story.
Yeah, I read some of because I believe the person in charge of the hospital had some notes or mail of theirs within the past 5 years found, which basically means, oh, new history book unlocked.
Right. We got some correspondence, hot new goss.
Hot new gossip. And at least from what excerpts that I read of that while doing this research, there was a lot of resistance from those in power and those of authority, especially because she shows up not only as a woman but as a non-established profession, not a part of the British military in like a traditional sense. Like she didn't go through, like, it's not like a medevac or an army medic that we would think of today. This was someone that was a nurse and then got 38 other nurses and went to Crimea because of a media report. So like they were outsiders to some extent beyond just being women in this space, but the conditions that brought them there.
Right.
So,
and there was also so much need to have medical staff.
Yeah.
That, I don't know, it just makes it tough. Like you wonder how welcome they actually were. And you're right, it's not just about Florence. There were 38 other women probably experiencing very similar issues.
Yeah.
She just happened to be the one who found something out.
I also, when Florence and the rest of, we'll just call them the rest of the early nurses, the renegade nurses,
her gals
started getting more and more control within the hospital, a lot of the soldiers' wives actually started coming out to help in the hospital because they needed more people. And one of the big challenges with keeping things sanitary is just doing laundry, like doing linens. And so I would imagine, and this is more speculative, but from a soldier's perspective, you have this group of women that are giving you dignity and not leaving you in like absolute filth, and that really care about your condition, not just after the battlefield, but the ongoing
the healing process.
The healing, yeah. And also I'm sure that being able to see your loved ones and have someone authorize your loved one coming out to help not only where you are, but to see you regularly. I think part of why she was so beloved as a cultural figure from that point on was because of how fondly a lot of the soldiers saw her. Like I would imagine that there was something quite profound about being helped, especially looking at how horrid the conditions were at the start of the war and how much better they got. So I think that it was a mixed bag. I don't think everyone loved her. That's not what I'm trying to argue, but I think she had some people in her court. It sure seemed like it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think she would have made it as far as she did.
Yeah.
If she didn't. And I actually think that's a really great point. Just it seems so obvious to us now, but having support while you're suffering is part of the healing process too.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know that now.
Yeah.
I don't think that was part of her theory either, but we do know that she went on to start a new school in 1860.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe like part of her life's work, I'll say, was about how do you end suffering?
Yeah, reducing suffering. Yeah.
And so I'm sure that she brought that force into her practice as well. And that's why I'm connecting it to all women in healthcare, I think, have that force.
Yeah.
And that's why I just feel safe around women in general, but there's just a sense that you're going to be okay when a woman's around that I don't feel with a man. And that can just be me. That, like, I'm sure there are so many people out there that would disagree. Or if you're a male doctor out there listening, you would disagree, right? But I wonder if that's like a part of the puzzle too with all of this. Because, like, yes, she discovered germs. Germs were up to no good in that war.
Yeah.
But I think there was more to it too. And
Yeah.
I like
Yep.
discussing that part of it because that part of healthcare has not gone away. In fact, it only went up when COVID happened.
Mhm.
I mean, that was like one of the biggest things people needed was just support.
In her early writing, she talks about like the conditions of wherever people are recovering, wherever patients are recovering. But she also does talk about things like being able to see the sunlight, have loved ones around you.
Yeah. I mean, that's the core of
activities.
nursing too.
It's just like things to keep the spirit alive. Like whatever's ticking to help aid recovery. You have to nurture the whole human being. And it's interesting looking at this period in medical history because a couple things are happening. We're right at the Industrial Revolution's beginnings, and so a lot of discoveries are being made really quickly. The other bit that's happening too is that there's this intersection between a lot of what we know as our modern medicine today and a lot of older knowledge. And a lot of that older knowledge is still very important today. My parallel for that is in the Italian Renaissance. There's a whole bunch of things that happened during the Renaissance. It's the Renaissance. But one of the
Renaissance.
but one of the big things that people were doing was they were reading really old texts and books from far away. And a lot of the new knowledge that, the Renaissance brought in was based off of old pieces of information recontextualized today. And so when researching Florence Nightingale, a lot of stuff about COVID was actually coming up too.
Oh, wow.
They kind of go hand in hand in some ways because, as I forget who says it, but it's that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes.
Yeah.
And I feel that this story is a great example of that phenomena.
I agree. I think the reason COVID comes up too is it's the one thing that everyone alive right now can relate to in some shape or form. Luckily not everyone has had health problems or like really big reasons to be in hospitals a lot before COVID. But I think COVID really questioned a lot of medicine, not only actual medicine and the practice of it, but the administration of it.
Yeah.
And how that fits with people's needs now. And I hope that maybe there's another Florence Nightingale out there.
Yeah.
Ready to stir some things up because you know what? The American healthcare system, don't even get me going on that. But I just want to thank you for bringing up this story. I hope that we can tell more stories like this that maybe aren't as well known of women and maybe a few men who had a hunch and really followed through with it and was able to change the world. I think that's just a really powerful thought.
Yeah.
Florence Nightingale, rest in peace, my lady. Before we end, I do just want to read our debrief questions again, because I think we kind of got to them a little bit.
Yeah.
But if anyone wants to read up on Florence Nightingale anymore, I urge you to take these questions with you. So the first one is, what does it take for a new idea to be accepted by the healthcare system? And this doesn't have to be like the literal ways. It can just be kind of food for thought. And then the other one is, why do women have to go above and beyond to prove their point? And that can be in the medical field, or you can kind of apply that to any profession.
Or just life.
Yeah. So take those questions with you. Take the story of Florence Nightingale. Do what you will. And I hope you learned something.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this week on the Can I Tell You Something podcast. We have new social media handles to tell you all about. So on Instagram, we are at Rough Draft Seattle, and on TikTok, we are at Rough Draft Media. We also have a website that should be launching at the beginning of February. It should be made public. February. And on the website, you'll have all of the links to all of our things that we're creating, because Rough Draft Media is not just the Can I Tell You Something podcast. It is more. And we're excited to share what more could be, will be with you all. All right.
All right. We will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.